Okay, so welcome to the 8th week of this program on human resource development, and here we are going to take up a new topic, an emerging topic in the area of management and development, especially human resource development and management, and this topic is known as competency mapping. Many of you may or may not be aware about this approach to human resource development, but what we are going to discuss is that whether there is an alternative to the training and development approach or not. So, this competency approach has been used or is being used by people or the professionals to identify the competencies which leads to higher performance, right. While the training and development approach, if you remember, it talks about identifying the gap in the performance based on what is expected from you, and then looking at your performance, so that you could be trained to achieve that level of performance, which is a benchmark performance or standard performance. But when we are using a competency approach to human resource development, the idea is not to go for benchmark performance, but go for a superior performance. Okay? Because nowadays most of the organizations are not interested you to have an average or standard performance. They want high performing individuals. Okay. So, these terms like high performing individuals or high performance organizations are very much common today in management field. Okay. And most of the professionals use these terms to explain that the requirement from the organization and an individual is to achieve superior performance in order to remain competitive in the market, right. And that is why this kind of approach has been used by the management and organizations today. So, what we are going to discuss in this course especially is that what is competency mapping, what are the different kind of frameworks or model that was used, what are the process, what are the various steps that is we can take up, and finally, we will take an example to explain that how competency mapping is carried out, right. So, we start our discussion with discussing certain basic concepts related to competency mapping. And if you look at this term competency, so we have to define this term, what is competency. If you look at this term of competency, it is nothing else, but it is related to your behavior, your skill or knowledge, which actually is important or which is basically the reason for high performance. Okay. That is why it is very important to ensure that you have those competencies which is related to high performance, right. So, a competent performer is understood to be someone who is going to perform very well, okay. And that is why we call him competent performers. He is not a standard performer, he is a superior performer, or he is going to achieve outstanding or superior performance, right. And then you have to see whether you have the competencies to achieve that superior performance or not, because organization is interested to ensure that you are not going to only perform at the expected level or the standard or average level, okay. But they are interested to ensure that you have those competencies which leads to higher performance or superior performance, right. So, if you look at the definition, it is identified as a characteristics of a person which helps him or enables him to deliver superior performance in a given job, role or situation. So, you remember the difference between training, that when we are talking about training, training is given to a person to perform effectively on the current job, right. An alternative to this, when you are talking about competencies which you also require to perform your job, is that you need all those characteristics in terms of knowledge, skill and behavior, the same thing we have been talking about in training. But this leads to help you to achieve superior performance in whatever job you are doing, okay? And that is why we are going to talk about more about the competency approach, right. So, look at some of the terms that we are going to use, like competence. Now, sometimes we ask, okay, whether you have this competence or not. Okay. Competence means that something that you have related to knowledge and skill which helps you to achieve your work. Okay. So, you are competent enough, probably you will be able to achieve superior performance. Competence means your basically areas of work, like your knowledge, your expertise, okay, your skill, your attitude, which is going to help you to become competent at the work. So, this competency comes from the word what we call competence. Now, if you are going to refer competencies, it is nothing else, but a set of competence, right, or a combination of that. So, if you are competent, you are showing it at the work, so it means that you are having those competencies, okay, which is going to help you to achieve superior performance. Now, after identifying these definitions of this competency term, we move further to discuss some other issues or see that how it is related to what we call competency. Now, competency is related to especially your knowledge, your skill and your attitude or what we call behavior. So, when you are talking about skill part, it means that you should have a set of skills which actually helps you to perform your job effectively, right, in whatever domain you are working. So, the first part of competency is related to a skill part. Now, if you look at the second part, this is related to knowledge part, right, the information, your cognitive domain and all kind of things. Okay. So, these two things are important, okay, as like in training, because you are going to train a person to see that he is equipped with the knowledge and skill to perform his job well, and similarly here also with the difference that it leads to superior performance, right. And then third part is related to what is your attributes in terms of characteristics, your behavior, your attitude, right. So, this is the qualitative aspects, while these two could be are also maybe a qualitative or quantitative both. So, if you look at attributes which belongs to your personality, your temperament, your characteristics, your attitude, these kind of things, okay, which are specific to the individual. Now, these three components actually make up your competency, right. So, the competency is nothing else, but it is made up of these three things, that is your knowledge, your skill and your attributes, and this competency leads to what you call superior performance or higher performance, right. Okay. So, if you have the competency not at the standard level, but the higher level, then you can expect an individual to achieve superior performance or outstanding performance. I hope that now you will be clear about the term competency and what are the various on how competency leads to superior performance. Now, it all started with you can say in the beginning, you know, that we had this trait and intelligence approach, okay, and it was thought that if you are having certain traits and you are intelligent enough, you will be able to perform well your job, right. And from there we move to another approach, okay, related to human performance, and this is known as competency management. And this competency measurement actually for the first time it was discussed by McClelland. He is actually credited with the concept what we call achievement motivation. Okay. So, he talked about achievement motivation, especially in American population, and he suggested that if you are highly motivated to achieve something, then you must have those competencies which is required to achieve a higher level of performance. And he suggested that there are certain populations in the world who are more motivated, are highly motivated to achieve certain things, and if they develop those competencies, they would be able to perform well. Okay. Now, if you look at this, you will find that there are two different approaches, right. The earlier approach that we have is this traditional approach, trait and intelligence approach, which was replaced by McClelland long back, and he talked about the competencies. Okay. And he said that in order to deliver human outstanding performance, okay, you need to develop certain competencies, or you should have those competencies which is going to help you to achieve higher performance, right. Later on people talk about certain factors, okay, because of which it is going to affect your performance, right. So, you have to see that these competencies need to be a very dynamic factor which keep on changing depending upon the changes that is happening, okay, in the organization and the societies. Because if you do not develop those competencies, you will not be able to cope up with the requirements of the either of the organization or the changes that is happening in the society. Say for example, if there is going to be a cultural social transformation in the society, you need to adjust and adapt yourself to the kind of changes. Now, for example, you see that there are generational gaps, okay, and the attitude and the behavior of the generations are different. So, somewhere the people from the older generations have to adjust themselves, or even the younger people have to adjust themselves with the changes that is happening in the society. So, unless you develop those competencies, okay, it is not possible for you. And similarly, in organizational context, you will find that lot of changes are happening, okay, in terms of quality, in terms of technology, in terms of systems, in terms of processes, okay, or even culture. So, if you are not competent enough, then probably you will be affected by these changes, and then it will not be good for you, because unless you develop those competencies to face these challenges that is created by the organization, you will not be able to perform well, right. So, these kind of concepts came in the beginning, and that is where people talked about competencies, starting with McClelland and later on. So, now if you look at this, you can find certain arrows here and see that how they are related. Okay. So, as we define it as underlying characteristics, right, which could be a combination of what you call personality, behavior, and that leads to behavior, and then this leads to what you call performance, right. So, this performance should be effective or superior performance, right. And so, your underlying characteristics include two things, that is your personality or attitude, and then your competencies, and this basically leads to what you call and behavior, effective behavior, which leads to better performance, and then this performance needs to be defined in terms of what you call effective or superior performance, okay, and that is how we are going to define these competencies, right. Moving further, if you look at how we are going to measure competency and performance. Okay. So, there are two ways that we can look at it. Okay. So, either you are going to see that effective performance or superior performance, right. Now, when it comes to measuring performance, okay, how you differentiate between competencies which leads to effective performance and which leads to superior performance. Okay. So, if when it comes to identifying performance, okay, you have to see and differentiate somewhere among the competencies, that what level of competency would be required for superior performance, okay, and what kind of competencies would be required for effective performance or standard performance. So, when we try to relate it, you can say that threshold competencies, okay, having the requisite knowledge, skill and attitude in order to perform your job well, that leads to what you call effective performance, okay, correct. But you need to go beyond these thresholds, okay, and see that whether you have those competencies which is going to differentiate you from your colleagues, friends, okay, fellows, and then this, if you are ahead in terms of level of those competencies, then probably it leads to higher performance, right. So, threshold competencies you can relate with effective performance, while higher level of competencies could lead to what you call superior performance, right. So, if you have higher level of competencies or the level of competencies are higher, then probably you would be able to reach to higher level of performance. Now, see how we differentiate between threshold competencies and differentiating competencies. Okay. There are a lot of competencies that we have at different level, which is helping us to perform well, right. And this is going to differentiate between a superior performer and an average performers, right. So, if you look at this figure, you will find that there are certain core competencies which have been there in the inner circle. So, what do you mean by core competencies? Core competencies which is must for you to perform well, right. But beyond that core competencies, there are certain other competencies, okay, which are central to your performance, which may not be visible to others, right. That is very important, okay, because if you look at certain competencies, some part of it is visible, okay, and at the surface which can be easily identified and recognized, and it is very important for you to have them in order to perform well. But that part of competencies which is not visible or which is very difficult to be recognized by others, sometimes that is what we call the X factor is a part of your higher performance. So, if you have those X factor, extra competencies or extra higher level of competencies, that is actually leads what you call leads to higher performance, right. So, after discussing this concept of competency, we move to the next part, that is competency mapping. Okay. So, the idea here is to that you identify those competencies which leads to better performance, right. So, here when we are going to talk about competency mapping, so the idea is that how we are going to map those competencies which is required for successful performance. So, if you are able to map those competencies, okay, then it can be said that yes, you will be able to perform successfully, okay, your job at any point of time, okay. And not here when I am saying perform successfully, it means that you would be not only meeting the expectation, that you would be ahead of the expectations. Okay. So, you will be reaching beyond expectations, and that is where you need to see that competency mapping exercises are being carried out in the organization to identify the gap in the talent or the knowledge and skill base. So, that you could be you can go for some kind of interventions to ensure that you achieve that higher level of competencies in order to perform well. Well, that is where we try to differentiate between the training approach and competency approach. In training approach, the idea is to identify the gap in order to see that the person is able to perform his job currently to meet the standard performance. Okay. But when we are talking about the gap in competencies, the idea is to identify the gap, so that you can take that person to a higher level of performance, right, by bridging these gaps to certain interventions. It could be coaching, could be mentoring, it could be training, or whatever it is, right, and that is what competency mapping means. So, there are different approaches that could be used to map the competencies, and it could start actually identifying different type of activities that you perform in a given job, okay, and then what kind of competencies would be required in order to perform the job, and these competencies could be related to different areas like your technical competencies or managerial competencies or behavioral competencies, whether you have sufficient knowledge or attitude or not, okay, to perform the job effectively. So, when we go for identifying competencies, we create a list of competencies across categories which could be related to the job, and then see that what kind of competency level would be required to achieve higher performance, not the average performance. We will discuss that how it is carried out at a later stage. Now, when we are talking about competency mapping, okay, so what is the competency map? Okay. So, you are going to map a competence the competencies of the people, right. So, it is going to give an idea about individual competencies, okay, and that can be done at the individual level to identify those factors which are critical to success in a given job for individuals, or it can be also done for the groups or the organization. So, you can map the competencies at 3 level, at the individual level, at the group level, as well as at the organization level, right. So, you can identify those factors which are responsible for better performance or higher performance. Now, when it comes to identifying or going for profiling of competencies, so you identify these things in terms of his knowledge, skill, attitude and other kind of things for effective performance in a given job or occupation. Okay. So, that is basically this profiling is done for a particular organization or particular company. Okay. This is the competence of the organization, okay. And that is where Prahlad actually talks about the core competence. This term is used, and that is where he talked about what kind of core competence is required for an organization to succeed and compete in the market. Okay. And the idea here is that you go for competency profiling to develop competencies of individuals, groups and organizations to ensure that they remain competitive. Okay. So, when you go for developing these competencies, you need to identify their existing level of competencies, what kind of competencies would be required to achieve a higher level of success, what is the gap, and then you plan certain interventions for that. Okay. So, this competency profiling is done to identify the existing level of competencies at 3 levels, individual, group and organizational levels, to find out what actually they have or exist in terms of knowledge, skill, attitude and behavior. Now, why we go for competency mapping, right? We need to map competencies to eradicate poor performance or to achieve higher performance, to ensure that there is low turnover, okay. High to ensure that yes, the turnover is not high, retention rate is very high, okay, and you also need to see that yes, there are certain needs that is not recognized through training programs, and here since you are not talking about poor performance, you have to see that people are not going to perform only at lower level or standard level that they, but they also move to higher level. And similarly, since organizations go for changes, so you have to see that how learning or other kind of things can help you to cope with those competencies, and that also helps you to go for succession planning and these kind of things. Okay. And that is why this competency mapping is required by the organizations. Now, moving further, if you look at some of the objectives or purpose why we go for competency mapping, okay, the idea is to look at the whether the organization is effective or not. An organization is going to be effective only when it possesses those competencies which is required, right. So, what is to be done here is that you identify the gap in the competencies, you try to make the role for everybody clear, so that they are able to understand what kind of competencies associated with each role. Okay. So, and that helps also not only to train them, but even at the selection stage you look for those people who are having or possessing those competencies at a higher level. Okay. So, in that way it also helps you to go for better recruitment and selection. Okay. You can identify the potentials, okay, those people who have potential in the organization who could be grown and developed. It can also be used as a tool for succession planning or restructuring. You know that you can go for a fast track career path for those who are performing well, who have high level of competencies, so that they do not leave the organization, right. And you can also develop competencies which would be required by the people depending upon the changes that is happening in the internal external environment. Okay. What we call that is future planning. So, for future you can also develop, okay, these kind of competencies would be required by us to deal effectively with the changes in the environment, and then your people should have these kind of competencies at all levels, right. Then moving further, let us see that there is a model which is known as iceberg model. It is a very popular model, okay, and this model suggests that different level of competencies are required by the people, right. And if you look at this iceberg model, it suggests that yes, the competencies may be in two categories, a part of that is hidden, part of that is visible, right. So, skill, the first part of the competencies, something that you are going to learn, okay, it is a learned ability, right. Then knowledge that you are going to acquire in a particular field, okay, to develop expertise. Then your own image, your concepts and values, that is also a part of this model, okay. And then you have traits, characteristics, attitude and these kind of things. Then you have motives, okay, what drives us to achieve power, influence, affiliation, okay, better performance, these kind of things. So, now if you look at this, these 5 terms which is a part of competencies includes skill, knowledge, values, self concept, traits and motives. Now, one example that I have given here is that start with say skill. So, look at something that is visible and something that is hidden. Okay. Now, starting with values, traits, motives, this is a part of the hidden talent, right, that you have. Your skill knowledge is known, because you know that suppose I say that yes, you are a BTech, you have a degree in computer science, you use Microsoft, other programming languages, right. So, that is a skill to perform your job. Okay. Now, values is something which is not actually included earlier. Okay. So, value is something like what kind of value system is going to drive you. One example that is taken here, like whether you are able to have good balance between your work life and family life or not. Okay. Self confidence, self concept, like whether you feel confident in your job or not. Okay. Traits, like it is a personality traits, like you are calm, quiet person or you are outspoken person, okay, whatever it is. Then motives, what do you want actually, what is the objective of doing certain things, whether you want to achieve some goals and then keep on doing that, okay, or you want to socialize, or you want to achieve power. Depending upon that, you are going to use these things to perform at a higher level. Now, the thing is that as I told you that part of it is hidden from the view and part of that is visible. So, what is visible here is the one that is, you can see here this part is visible and this part is visible. So, it is a kind of tip of the iceberg only. What is more important and significantly contributes to your performance is these things, not these things, and this is visible and this is hidden part, right. Now, where we are going to use these competencies, different kind of competencies. Okay. It has lot of application in different areas, right, starting with selection, managing reward for competence, career development, training and development, even succession planning, performance management, even consulting for performance, right. So, you can find out that yes, competency mapping has been used in a wide areas, a wide field related to human resource development and management, right. For example, you can go manage the performance of people at a higher level. Okay. Once you identify the competencies, you can pay higher salary to those who are really competent enough, okay, are performing very well. Okay. They could be promoted, like you can think about the career development. Okay. If they do not have those career say competencies, then you can think about training and development activities. Okay. You can also plan successions for them, okay, that when and how they are going to take senior positions. Okay. Not only that, even you can go for selecting such people in future who have or who demonstrate higher level of competencies, right. And if there are problems related to performance, okay, you can identify the gaps and go for consulting or counseling even also, or even coaching can be done. Okay. All kind of things can be done. Okay. And then you can identify the core competence related to the job. Okay. So, this is the core competence which is required to perform job at an effective level. Moving further, what we are going to discuss is that we have seen that okay, these are the applications where we go for having competencies. Okay. So, the first is competency frameworks. Okay. So, the competency framework is basically is something that covers all the key jobs in an organization. Okay. So, those competencies that need to be identified, which requires for almost all kind of jobs, right. So, they are known as generic competencies, general competencies. Okay. So, whether you are a manager, whether you are a lawyer, whether you are a doctor, okay, these are some of the generic competencies which is required by you to perform your job effectively. Okay. Okay, like having leadership qualities and all say managing time, being assertive, right, or having right kind of attitudes. So, these kind of things are required, having good communication skills, right, good interpersonal skills, right, being creative. So, these are some of the generic qualities or generic competencies which may be required across the jobs, right. And through competency frameworks, you need to identify what are the various competencies, general competencies or generic competencies which is required across the job. Then we talked about competency maps. In competency maps, you are going to measure the specific qualities that is required for performing the job effectively. So, for a senior manager, what kind of competencies, technical competencies or functional competencies would be required, right. So, you need to map them, which is associated with a particular occupational job, like having a strategic capability, how you are going to manage resource, quality, productivity in these kind of things, right. And then you have profiles. Okay. It means that it is associated that what kind of things that you require. Okay. Based on these competency frameworks and maps, you are going to develop a profile of the individual who is going to perform a specific role in the organization, okay, at the individual level, right. So, these are some of the applications of the competencies, and that is all for the first session. Thank you.